teachers. Today is about bridging the cultural divide. Really important. So, we're talking about this challenge that continues to impact schools everywhere, every school I've been to. What happens in education and what happens to educators who fully don't understand the communities that they're serving, right? And this isn't just about culture, it's about trust, belonging, discipline, attendance, and ultimately your student achievement, right? And so think about this. The good news is that everybody in the country are really leaning towards a community-connected approach that can truly transform outcomes. I always say sometimes schools or people can be the barriers. So this is about the individual barrier to achievement. Sometimes when students feel misunderstood, disconnected, or even unseen, this impact reaches way beyond just behavior. Students begin to disengage. You're starting to see students that have changed academically, maybe emotionally. What may appear as kind of defense syndrome is, truly about reflection, maybe a culture, a misunderstanding, or just an unmet educational aspiration or need, right? And so over time, these patterns begin to erode that belonging and trust, and it happens all inside of your school. I've said this multiple times. It's the demographic mismatch with the expectation gap. So nationally, of course, our student population has become increasingly more diverse. I don't know if you're looking inside your classrooms, right? While teaching workforce remains predominantly white and predominantly white women. So diversity is not the problem. The issue is whether or not the educators that are in your schools are equipped to understand and connect with the lived experiences of the students that they serve, right? And so without true intention with cultural responsiveness, the mismatch continues to fester. And, think about the low expectations, increased discipline, the patterns, the disparities, and it just weakens student-teacher relationship. Okay, so let me break it down, right? How culture kind of shapes this misbehavior. So, we think about behaviors often kind of interpreted through the lens of personal, experiences or whether cultural norms, right? And so what one teacher or educator may see as kind of disrespect, another community will view it as just normal communication or expression of thoughts and feelings. So when our teachers lack that cultural context, subjective discipline continues to increase, right? And so this slide, which I love, just reminds us that discipline, is not always kind of about the rules. It's always about the lens of the interpretation. So I know it may seem like I'm always talking about the divide, the digital divide, the, content divide, but this is the cost of the cultural divide, right? And so when schools, think of your school, and if it fails to intentionally build relationships and cultural understanding with the community, who pays the price? Of course, our students pay the price academically, socially, and of course, emotionally. Our students begin to participate less. The attendance may drop. Maybe they don't want to come to school. The discipline becomes, more exclusionary. The cultural divide just creates another barrier that may affect student success. Hey, so it's not all the things. Right now we're talking about a paradigm shift, right? We're reimagining schools and maybe the school hub or the school network or the school connection, right? And so this work requires this mindset shift, right? This change. We think traditionally, schools are operated in isolated institutions, always focus on academics and what's the compliance mechanism. But now we're moving towards, hopefully, a community-connected school where the school just sees themselves differently. And that's okay, right? They become hubs for belonging of parents, the partnerships and the support, where educators are, not just the content experts, but they are true community partners. That's what we want. Okay, I like to call these the four big buckets. These are the kind of the four pillars. We think of community schools, they're successful because they address the whole child, right? Thinking of the whole child and the whole community. Now we're talking about integrated supports. So we're talking about true connection with community, organizations. They expand their learning opportunities outside of the four walls, right? We always say in academia, get out of the ivory tower. What does that look like? And how are you doing it in schools? And we're collaborative leadership, right? So we are not the only expert, right? We take on the experts of the community. There's strong family engagement. We're working together to create these ecosystems where students feel safe. What works at home, we can implement some of those things at school, and what works at school, we can implement some of those things at home, right? Where families feel safe to come in the classroom, where they feel safe to come in the school, and they're supported and they're empowered empowered to help their children succeed academically. So now we're talking about cultural competence to cultural humility, right? And so when we think about cultural competence, it really suggests that, culture is a kind of a master checklist, right? And so, but we think of cultural humility, we can definitely say that goes deeper. It requires that continuous reflection, continuous listening, changing, modifying, learning, being self-aware, right? And this shift challenges our teachers to kind of move beyond the face assumptions and to engage with students and family with empathy, right? We lead with empathy, curiosity, and true respect for what that family brings. And many of us schools are starting to reimagine discipline, with context and true care. We're moving away from the zero tolerance to restorative justice, restorative relationship based approaches. We're seeing measurable academic gains and cultural gains when we look at it through that lens. And then we talk about restorative practices that help students just remain connected to the school building while having accountability, right? And repairing some of the harm that we've done. And so we think about our teachers, our educators, our custodial staff, just building those strong relationships and just that lasting change to stay connected with our students. So I kind of feel like, Mr. Clark, about the parent-home teacher visits, and I think one of the most powerful strategies for building trust is meeting families where they are. So many times home visits allow teachers, educators, to understand students beyond the classroom. It shifts their conversation away from management discipline towards, building relationships. What are the aspirations, partnerships that we can provide? This not only humanizes families, but also educators. So just keep that in mind. Now you may say I don't want to go into people's home. I don't feel remember, you're not alone going into people's home, but home visits drive outcomes. The data is pretty much there. Schools improving structured home visits, models have seen significant reductions in chronic absenteeism, increased academic achievement. This kind of reinforces that important aspect is when families trust schools, students are more likely to perform better. Now, there's also evidence in community schools and how we can close that achievement gap, right? And so we think community-connected strategies, are more than just good intentions. They're evidence-based school improvement practices, right? We're talking about schools implementing these approaches, see gains in attendance as well, reduction in suspension, measurable academic growth, particularly for students who kind of are, historically underserved, minority students. I always like to say this is the cycle of connection. This is the big picture. Family engagement, restorative practices, culturally responsive, instruction are not isolated, right? They're together in a cycle. They strengthen that belonging. They build trust. And, when you think about these relationships that you're building, achievement occurs and outcomes improve. All right, so here is the playbook. Let's go the action steps for this year, right? So the question now is, what can you do as a leader or as a teacher leader or principal immediately do? They begin by auditing your relationships, auditing your discipline data, strengthen your family partnerships that you have going on cultural reflective staff practices, right? Just thinking about how do we redesign discipline systems and our community voice at the center of it. What can we do to have little small interactions, just shifts to create that long-lasting school transformation. So I like to say this is the heart of every school community, every idea, right? The culture is a community, and we are not making that as a barrier for access and learning. So when actually our school is a center of our belongingness and our relationships and our authentic connection, our students do well. This is kind of the future of our educational leadership, and it really depends on what your willingness to do and what are you doing to lead with empathy and partner with the very people you serve. I hope these tips help. Talk to you later for more. Bye.